So when you're cooking on TV, taste is all that matters. The only thing that the chefs or the judges put in consideration and are lenient on is temperature. Because as you know, once you cook the dishes out, they're hot. With the way that things are produced in television, sometimes these dishes are sitting there before the judges get to taste them, and oftentimes they get cold. So you can't truly judge a dish on whether it's hot or cold other than its taste. My name is Viet Pham. I'm a chef restaurateur here in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm an award-winning chef, and you might have seen me on lots of different Food Network or food television. Probably most notable is Iron Chef America. And many other shows.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over.
First off, congrats on your recent expansion. As I've learned, you have 4 locations now with your restaurant, Pretty Bird. Is that right?
Yeah, 4 locations, slowly working on our 5th. And hopefully to Southern California soon.
Having one is a big feat. What made you decide to expand like that?
Thinking back, so my background used to be in fine dining, and it's a different level of cooking that I was doing then, but at the same time, with a business mindset, I knew that working in a fine dining with a set menu, it's not something that was going to be scalable. So, early on, I knew that eventually, once I get out of fine dining, I want to work on a concept that is, that is a little bit easier, but more importantly, something that I can scale. So, most of our growth has happened actually in the last 3 years. Now, if you think about the last 3 years, you think about the pandemic. And, at the same time, there were a lot of restaurant closures, especially restaurants that were sit-down style restaurants. Fortunately for myself, Pretty Bird, we're a fast casual restaurant. We serve food that I like to think that is very comforting, and that's fried chicken. So, during that time when a lot of restaurants were closed, we were, one of the fortunate restaurants that were able to maintain being open, because we basically, like a lot of other restaurants, pivoted to an online to a pickup style of restaurant. So, a lot of people were able to visit Pretty Bird, but more importantly, by visiting Pretty Bird, they were able to experience a sense of normalcy. And I think because of that, our restaurant did really well, and we're grateful for that. And I'm sure those of you that are listening, including yourself here, Kenneth, that you've probably known of countless people that have lost their restaurants and their businesses during the pandemic. But we were the fortunate ones. So yeah, most of our growth has happened in the last 3 years, and we're hoping to, expand Pretty Bird's footprint to outside of Utah, as I mentioned, to Southern California along the beach cities, and then around the surrounding mountain states of Utah. So that's the goal, and then beyond.
I look forward to that. I like to get into everybody's background about how they got to where they are with especially chefs and artists. It's such an interesting progression with everybody's life. But before we get to that, I want to talk about your name is tied forever with another man, Bobby Flay. And, you beat him twice, and, how does that, make you feel? Because, as I was reading about that, I thought to myself, that's my biggest nemesis. I must have an opinion on that. So I wanted to ask you that.
Yeah. I didn't realize the, how should I say this? The magnitude of being someone who beat him twice. So, when I was filming my 3rd show with him. So the first show I did, Iron Chef America. This is the second food television show that I ever did. And, originally when I started that show, the person that I wanted to go against was Masaharu Morimoto. And the season that I did it with, it was later on in the season. And they didn't allow oncoming chefs to choose who they go against anymore because the schedules of the Iron Chefs were so busy. So basically, when you get on set, literally minutes before you actually get onto the kitchen stadium, they let you know who you're going against. I was really bummed out because I was shooting for Morimoto because I felt like as a young chef at that time, Morimoto, he resonated with me more with my cooking style. And I just admire Japanese cuisine, and him being a Japanese chef and being of Japanese origin, I just felt like this is going to be something that's going to be like extremely competitive, and being able to like for me to test my abilities. But as soon as I walked on, they're like, "Hey, you're going to go against Bobby Flay," and I'm like, "Darn it." Bobby Flay, I'm like, all right, whatever. And Bobby Flay was kind of an upcoming chef at that time. But now that I think about it strategically, like it probably was a better thing that I went against Bobby Flay because he is a more well-known chef and he's more of a household name, and I beat him. I think the win on that Iron Chef was his worst loss. My win was his worst loss. Based on the score and percentages. And then, after that, I got onto another show, which was Food Network Star. And that was Food Network's marquee show. It was their biggest franchise. And on the show, there's three, like heavyweights, and that's Bobby Flay, Giada De Laurentiis, and Alton Brown. And basically, they become your mentor. So I got onto this show, and I made it about halfway through, and Bobby mentored me. And then after that, he, I guess he developed a really deep respect for me. And, for those of you that like watch, shows at home, Bobby is the type of person that for some reason, he comes off TV very abrasively, and a lot of people don't like him. But, coming from a chef, he is coming from a chef like myself and other chefs. I have like the utmost respect for him because at the end of the day, he is a cook. As much as he is a television personality, being a cook runs in his blood. And because he is a cook, he recognizes and he respects other cooks. So when you look at his cooking shows, they're very much oriented towards cooking. And it's not like, oh, I'm going to have you cook with your eyes blindfolded and your one hand behind your back. It's really purely about your cooking style and your abilities, So he invited me on to Beat Bobby Flay, which was 5 years into his show. And this also coincided with the opening of Pretty Bird. So this was in 2018. We filmed Beat Bobby Flay 2 months before Pretty Bird opened. And I thought to myself, what better way than to battle Bobby Flay with fried chicken, because he's known for his fried chicken and some of his Southern or his Tex-Mex cooking. But, also because I beat him in Iron Chef America, and it was very much focused around fine dining, plated dishes, very intricate cooking. And meticulous cooking. I figure, okay, so, I beat him there. Let's beat him on something that is more casual and in his ballpark. So, but at the same time, it was also a big risk because if I battled him against fried chicken and then Pretty Bird opens and I lose, what's that going to say about Pretty Bird? But it's life is all about a gamble, right? So I went ahead and battled him on fried chicken and then beat him. So it wasn't until a year ago when he invited me back onto a show called Bobby's Triple Threat, which is his newest show. He basically kind of, on this new show, he hung up his apron. He's not cooking anymore. Instead, he brings on 3 of his quote unquote titans. So basically, these are his best of the best cooks. And as a chef, as a competitor, you go on and you battle against 3 of his titans. So on the introduction, as I walk in, I remember vividly, he goes, okay, so here's Viet, somebody that I've really admired as a cook. And also, he is the only chef that has the distinction of beating me twice. That's when it really hit me. I'm like, oh, shit, I actually really did beat him twice, on Iron Chef America and Beat Bobby Flay. And here I am on his newest show, cooking against Titans and not against him. So technically, I beat him in 3 of his shows. But the most recent show, Bobby's Triple Threat, I beat his 3 Titans, or 2 of his 3 Titans. Yeah. So it's to answer your question, I never really thought of it as a big deal until he said that I was the only one with the distinction. And now that I think about it, I feel very proud, but at the same time, I have the utmost respect for him, and he is a very talented cook. He is truly humble, and he appreciates the hard work that goes into being a cook. And with that said, like that's pure respect.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because if I had beat some big name, if I had let somebody beat me twice and I'm a big name, I would probably be really upset, be like, oh, that's my nemesis. But there's always this backstory to every relationship where there's a common ground, there's a respect there, and I got to hear it, so I really
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah. So, nothing but respect to Bobby Flay. But yeah, it's been an interesting journey. And I look back and there's been a lot more tougher times than there are easier times, but that's what makes us us, right?
Yeah. What goes into the strategy of these cooking shows? I'm sure there's a million answers, but like, is there a general mindset that goes into it when you approach a contest?
Yeah. So the number one strategy is every single show, regardless of what type of competition show it is, the number one strategy is they'll tell you, don't overthink it. Oftentimes, with especially time constraints, people tend to overthink things. So being a competition chef is very, very much different from being a kitchen chef. I've learned this early on. I've been doing television cooking for the greater part of 15 years. And early on, when I first did my show, what I realized what my strengths were was being able to work under pressure. And as you know, with a lot of chefs working in a high caliber kitchen, there's always a lot of pressure, not just putting the food out, but commanding a kitchen, managing your staff, the pressures of the media and all that. There's a lot of that. And also, you tend to have a lot more time in a kitchen. You have a team of cooks and you have hours to prep for whatever it is before service begins. Whereas on a television show, sometimes you have 20 minutes to put together an intricate dish, and oftentimes if you're the chef who's kind of wishy-washy, or you can't decide, or you try to overthink things and complicate things, you're going to run out of time. So there's a lot of that strategy that's involved. Two, you're not truly competing against the other person because you never really even see the other person. The only person you're truly competing against is yourself. And that's managing yourself, telling yourself to, either practice restraint, manage time, not overthink things. Those are the two biggest things. So time management and not to overthink yourself or not to overthink things. And those are the things that truly make a successful television competitive chef versus somebody that has just started and is overthinking things.
As an audience member, we can only see and hear what's going on, but we can't really taste the food. And I always wonder, how good does the food really taste when you're under those conditions? Or is it just a TV show where the judges kind of have to give a little forgiveness and space for how quickly these things are put together?
Yeah. So when you're cooking on TV, taste is all that matters. The only thing that the chefs or the judges put in consideration and are lenient on is temperature. Because as you know, once you cook the dishes out, they're hot. With the way that things are produced in television, sometimes these dishes are sitting there before the judges get to taste them, and oftentimes they get cold. So you can't truly judge a dish on whether it's hot or cold other than its taste. So when you watch these cooking shows, the one thing that you should pay attention to most is whether or not the chefs are tasting. Tasting, like the mark of a good cook at home or a good chef is that you're constantly tasting. You have to constantly taste, because as you cook, flavors develop. As you add things, flavors change. And at the end of the day, you're trying to build, harmony with all of your flavors. Or if you're going for something that's spicy, you want to make sure that the heat is there. So it's really important that you taste your food. And at the end of the day, if you're putting out food that tastes like crap, the judges are gonna taste that, and they're not going to give you high marks. And the objective, as you know, is to put out good food and to win. So at the end of the day, you know, there is no cover up in the magic of TV that you could just put out whatever it is as long as the plate looks good. It has to taste delicious.
I'm listening to a veteran chef speak about cooking, and I am going back into my visual imagination about how you and your mom and dad probably have journeyed through the time of you becoming somebody in the food space. Traditionally, Vietnamese men, are not welcomed in the kitchen. How did this all unfurl in your family?
You know, that's a really good question. Kind of like what you said. You know, I didn't grow up in the kitchen. You know, although I ate Vietnamese food every day when my mom cooked at home, it wasn't my food of choice. It wasn't my preference. You know, when I think about my relationship with Vietnamese food, with the Vietnamese culture, it's actually a rather very complicated relationship. You know, and I think a lot of first generation immigrants, especially Vietnamese, could probably relate to like my story. And my story is really no different from a lot of other people's story. So, my parents were boat people. They fled Vietnam, came to the United States in 1979. I was born in a refugee camp on an island of Pulau Bidam off the eastern coast of Malaysia in the state of Terengganu. So we were there for about 8 months. And I came to the United States when I was about 6 months old with my parents. And then we ended up in the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. So, as a kid, growing up in this poor family, we lived in this townhouse with other families, my aunts, uncles, cousins. Living in that family with a lot of people, there's always joy, there's always excitement, there's family meals and we do things together. You don't really see the struggle. The struggle didn't come until we were old enough to go to school. So, as a kid, with my name being Viet and my brother being Nam, and the reason my parents named us that was because it was my grandparents' wishes when my parents fled Vietnam, that if they were to call us Vietnam, they would never forget their country, because at that time when they fled, they weren't sure if they were ever able to come back. So in school is when we kind of experienced a lot of the pains. And when I say pains, being picked on, being bullied because of her name, and then being bullied and picked on because we were different, because of that coincided with who I am. That was being a Vietnamese American, the food that I ate, how I was treated. And for me, in my young self, I realized that everything that I am was not what I wanted, because it was associated to pain. So, growing up, if we ate Vietnamese food, it was like, all right, I didn't prefer it. But if my parents took us out to go, eat McDonald's, or, one of my childhood favorites, Portillo's, it was one thing that I looked forward to, because at the end of the day, it made me feel more American by eating American food. So, growing up, I didn't spend a lot of time in the kitchen. I did taste a lot of things that my mom made. One of the things that probably stood out most is she used to fry, pork fat that goes into hủ tiếu. And I just remember eating that. That was like my kind of version of like my first taste of bacon, just like that crispy molten fat, crunchy flavor of the pork fat, So, I mean, even until now, I don't know a lot of Vietnamese cooking. One of the first ingredients that I've started using, which was very recently, was red boat fish sauce. So my relationship has been very complicated. But growing up, cooking was also a necessity for myself and my brother, because early on, my parents worked odd-hour shifts, which meant that my brother and I had to learn how to kind of cook and take care of ourselves while my parents were at work, because they didn't have the luxuries of hiring babysitters. So, one of my first food memories is my parents teaching us how to boil water so that we can make ramen or mì gói, and we would do this at an age from, gosh, I remember like 4 or 5. I was 5, my brother was 4. We were making instant ramen for each other. And then, over time we get bored, and then we would take leftovers, we'd take hot dogs, throw them in there. We would make a dry version of ramen, a wet version of ramen. And then, we were kind of coined like the ramen kings, So, I think at that point, it started I developed this sense of this creative process, and cooking was my outlet. So, as a kid, a lot of kids on Saturdays, they love watching cartoons. For me, I was watching PBS. I was watching shows like Yan Can Cook. I was watching Jacques Pepin, Julia Child. Those are the shows that I gravitated to. And later through the years, my parents ended up moving us to California, and then they started a catering truck business. And even then, at that time, food to me was like a punishment because my parents had catering trucks, and then on Saturdays or Sundays, we would have to go to their commissary. We'd have to clean these trucks. We'd have to get ice for the trucks and do shopping. And once again, like it's these things that have like this negativity. Like I could have been at home hanging out with my friends, sleeping in, but instead on Sundays I have to do these things. But the cooking itself, I've always gravitated to. And, I was always the guy who was always cooking when there was a barbecue or when friends were over, or when we come home from late night drinking, and we're rummaging through our cupboards looking for food. So,
wait, can I stop you right there? I want to know more about the catering truck. What were they doing before the catering truck?
So my dad so his first job in the United States, he was working for a machine shop, and he was basically just doing odd end jobs for this machine shop. And my mom ended up working for this company where she was just soldering chips on a motherboard. So that was their job, and then it wasn't until 1987 or 1986 when my dad's cousin out of California, he's like, hey, you should consider moving to California. We have this catering truck business. You might want to get into it. It's really good. Money's really good. So that's when my parents moved us out to the Bay Area in 1987.
And was the catering business good?
Yeah, it was really good. From there to the dot-com era, like my parents were busy. My parents did really, really well up until I want to say 2006 or 2007, after the crash. That's when they kind of left the business. But, they were in the business for over 30 years.
Wow. And what kind of food were they cooking?
All of it. American, Mexican, Chinese, Vietnamese. They're doing all of it, just different interpretations of their native food, Vietnamese food. And then it would just cross over, So, like when I think back to that, like they would make American food, but it was never quite really American food because there would be like a hint of Asian somewhere in there. So like I was never even a fan either of their food, but like when my mom did traditional homemade cooking, when I think back now as an adult, it's like, it was really good. And I really do miss it. But back then there was just interpretations of American food, but they developed a following. So it worked out really, really well for them.
Yeah. Wow. What so interesting to hear the background of. So when you probably got into the food business, it wasn't out of the blue for them.
It was kind of, and it kind of wasn't. So, again, I'm going to go back and talk about like, the Asian American experiences and what all of our parents wanted. I feel like every parent, especially Vietnamese parents, wants their kids to be, some type of engineer, an attorney, or a doctor, and, I try to go that path in engineering. It just didn't work out. Ended up settling in finance. And I was just never happy. I had enrolled into culinary school at one point in San Francisco. I went to the California Culinary Academy, and it was a year and 3 month kind of process. And even then, I really, really hated it. It just didn't challenge me. And also, I want to preface, I was never a really good student. I think back, like I was just an average to below average student that kind of just hovered through the radar. No one ever really paid attention, and I think one of the reasons why I never did so well was because school never really challenged me in the way that I needed to be challenged. And the structure and idea of school was very similar to cooking school. And once again, it didn't challenge me. So, one of the things that I was truly grateful for with culinary school is that part of our curriculum, you have to do an internship with the restaurant for, 90 days. So for 3 months or wherever, a lot of my peers were getting internships like at Whole Foods and Costco. I'm like, you're paying this much money so you could go work at these restaurants, or these establishments. So, for me, I knew that I wanted to do something in like Japanese cooking. And I tried to apply for this internship in Sydney, Australia, but I don't know what happened. My paperwork got lost. It never ended up happening. And I ended up literally down to the wire, last minute of the day that I'm supposed to submit my internship. I got an internship with a young French chef from New York in San Francisco. His name is Laurent Gras. He had a restaurant in San Francisco called the Fifth Floor, a hotel called Palomar. So I did an internship there, and it was probably one of the most difficult things that I've ever done in my life, because here I am, this young, wannabe cook who's aspiring to be the chef. And I'm working in some of the toughest kitchens. And when you think about kitchen culture, prior to, the last 4 or 5 years, it was really, really rough. Everything that you've heard of, it's absolutely true. All the bad, all the good, mostly bad, it's all true. But, through that, at the end of the day, you have a choice. You have a choice of either continue to push or you can quit. And if you quit, you quit. At that time, I knew that there was nothing more that I wanted than, one, to earn the respect of my peers, get the approval of the chef that I was working for. So every day I would work, and then every day I would literally get my ass kicked physically, emotionally, and mentally every single day. But, through that, like I said, you have a choice. You could quit or not. But, for some reason, I just knew that cooking was something that I was meant to do. And most of all, I was a competitive person in the sense that I'm going to earn everybody's respect. And how am I going to do that? I'm going to continue pushing and pushing and pushing. And despite all of that, slowly, I garnered the respect from my peers. And then one day, a chef looked at me and be like, hey, I was doing some task. And he's like, you know what? Today you're actually thinking. As insulting as that is, that was like the biggest compliment that I ever got, from him. And it meant that I was on the right path. So, I worked with him for a couple of years, and then I got burnt out as a very young cook. And then I left. And then I ended up working for Washington Mutual. And then from there, transitioned into a software company called VMware. So when I was at VMware, I was in my later 20s. This is when I realized that living in this Bay Area, being in this rat race, making X amount of money, having this type of car or this type of house was not something that brought me happiness. All along, I knew that the happiness that lied within me was being in the kitchen, was creating, was feeding people. And day after day, that longing became more and more powerful. And ultimately, one day, it was, I think, January of 2008, I had this opportunity to move to Utah to help a friend open up a restaurant. So fast forward 5 months, packed up my stuff. It was May of 2008. Moved out to a city called Provo, which is about an hour south of Salt Lake City. I helped open this restaurant called Spark, and it didn't work out. And mainly it didn't work out because myself and my partner, we just didn't have the best relationship. So I ended up working there for 8 months and then ultimately getting fired. And during that time, as difficult as it was, here I was 29 years old for the first time ever in my life. I'm not living at home, because I was living at home until 29. And aside from not living at home, I was in a whole new place. I didn't have any friends. I didn't have any family that I could count on. I just had myself in this little apartment. And it was very, very difficult, So, through those days, I would keep a journal and I would kind of write down, if I had my own restaurant, how would things be differently? How would things be different? And how would I treat things differently? What would the philosophy of my cooking be? And, you know, as much as I didn't like working there, at that time, it was such a pivotal moment, a key moment in my career because of that struggle. Um, the idea and the opportunities was born, you know, like they kind of say, like the phoenix rises from the flame, you know, all the way up until the day that I got fired. You know, when I got fired, you know, I've never been fired ever in my career, ever in my life. And this is the first time I got fired. And I've only been in Utah for 8 months. So, you know, I called my parents and I told my parents that, like, I just got fired. Um, but I don't want to go home. You know, a couple days ago, before getting fired, you know, I was on Craigslist and I found this space in Salt Lake City that I fell in love with. It was this house that was empty. It had a parking lot, and it reminded me of a lot of very charming high-end restaurants in the Bay Area, like the French Laundry, Manresa, and that's what I aim to do. So, you know, the process of working for my partner, being, you know, miserable, you know, writing my journey, thinking about all the things that I would do differently. It also led me to driving up to Salt Lake City, you know, on the weekends, searching around for, you know, for this made up restaurant that I would have one day. And it wasn't until I got fired that it pushed me to do it. So, you know, after I got fired, drove up to Salt Lake City, signed the lease, and then 6.5 months later, opened up a restaurant called Forage. And Forage was just, you know, a small little restaurant. It had 32 seats. We did a set menu. It was the only set menu restaurant in the state of Utah at that time. So basically, when I say set menu, you as a guest, you come in, you would get 14 to 17 courses. There were no options. You would just basically trust the kitchen, the cooks, and the chef. You know, with this concept,
like an omakase.
Yeah, like an omakase, exactly. You know, so with this concept, you know, after a couple of years, I ended up getting Food and Wine Magazine's Best New Chef, and that was probably the biggest pivotal moment of my career. Because as a young chef, there's two things that you want to have. You want to have a James Beard Award, or you want to get an award from Food and Wine Magazine. So each year they choose 10 chefs from across the country. And when you think about like Thomas Keller from the French Laundry, some of the greatest chefs, they're a part of this very small class. And when I started working in San Francisco under Laurent Gras, he had just been elected as best new chef. And I remember as a young cook thumbing through the magazine and telling myself, you know, one day I'm going to work my ass off and get this award. So, you know, fast forward to 2011, you know, I got the phone call, got the award. And, you know, it proved that, you know, despite all the difficulties, all the sacrifices, you know, at the end of the day, if you continue to push and go for what you believe in, you know, it'll pay off, you know. So I was very fortunate, got that award. And with that award, it opened up a lot of doors, television, other awards, other opportunities. And here I am now sitting in front of you talking to you about this.
Oh, what an amazing journey.
Yeah.
What kinds of food did you do at Forge? It just sounds like a very you know, whatever's in season, that's what you're going for, right?
Yeah. So the name Forage came from the fact that aside from the love of restaurants and cooking, I love the outdoors. And you know, being in the outdoors was a place that brought me lots of comfort. When I was young, I was in Boy Scouts. You know, we lived near the mountains and we did a lot of hiking, and I loved that. So at that time in 2009, foraging was starting to become a very hip thing because of a restaurant called Noma in Copenhagen. You know, they did a lot of foraging. And one of the things that I learned early on living here in Utah is that we're surrounded by this amazing mountain range called the Wasatch Mountain Range. And spending a lot of time outdoors, I realized that there is an incredible bounty of edible things all over the place in the mountains, mushrooms, herbs, you know, fish, critters, all sorts of stuff. So that led my curiosity into buying books, you know, reading about foraging, attending classes about foraging, and starting to incorporate the things that I find into our dishes. So at that time as well, there was a rise in a concept called farm to table, like, oh, this is a farm to table restaurant. Well, we weren't just farm to table. We were like a hyper local restaurant, utilizing things that you can't get from the farm. They don't grow naturally in the farm, so it set us apart. So the type of food that we cooked was like, I say contemporary American, but it was like a melting pot. We utilized all sorts of techniques, ingredients, Japanese, American, Middle Eastern. But at the end of the day, the cuisine was very thoughtful. The dishes were very thoughtful, very complex, very methodical. There was a level of finesse. And, each plate was, I don't know, 3 to 4 bites at most. And it would add up to between 14 to 17 courses. And the narrative around it was telling a story in which we lived, in Utah. There's, during a certain part of the season, there's a type of herb that you can get, a type of fish that you can get. And, like, it wasn't easy to get it. And like, that kind of carried that narrative. Yeah.
How much of the Noma bullseye, the Noma target in your mind is happening when you were running Forage? Like, did you have it, pinned on a map mentally and say, that's kind of like where I want to be?
At that time, Forage happened for several different reasons. First and foremost, it was for selfish reasons, for reasons that I was angry, and that was to get back at my previous partnership. I'm like, you fired me. I'm going to open up this restaurant and you're going to regret it, but those are the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And then with that mentality, I started to shift and kind of like dive into my cuisine and cooking and nature, and then kind of forgot about that. And that kind of just carried me. But, when I first started this concept of Forage, I was just a young cook. I wanted to copy these amazing restaurants that I admired, and in Utah, there's a saying that we're always 10 years behind. And even though what I was doing or what I was copying is relatively nothing new, but in Utah, it was new. So being in Utah at that time, there was a culmination of being in the right place at the right time, doing things that led me to become a successful chef, But yeah, I try to copy a lot of things. Sous vide, which is like cooking in a bag, was a very big thing. And then all of a sudden, thinking more and more about the name Forage, and then learning that it's becoming popular, we started to incorporate some of that. Again, this is because as a young cook or young artist, you lend your inspiration from other great chefs, other great mediums and artists, So, like, we had to find a pathway. So we started foraging, and at the end of the day, there's other restaurants out there. You have to ask yourself, what sets yourself apart from other restaurants? On any given weekend, you and I can go to the farmer's market. Let's say you have a restaurant, I have a restaurant. We have access to the same ingredients and we're doing the same things. How's that going to separate us aside from, our cooking techniques or maybe even the ingredients? So for us, it was really ingredient driven and terroir driven,
When I think about foraging, I think about how nervous I would be to pick out the wrong berry or the wrong mushroom and feed it to somebody, and you watch them basically flailing on the floor. How do you prevent that? Like, how do you know that whatever you're doing is safe?
It requires an incredible amount of research, lots of reading, classes. But at the end of the day, there's native species that are edible. Let's just say Boletus edulis, which is boletes or king boletes, which translates to, you and I know as porcini mushrooms. There are several varieties of them, and I only forage for things that I know 100% are edible. Things that I don't know, things that I question, I always take pictures or samples back. And then there's a huge community that can dive in and help you with that. But we only play it safe and pick things that we know 100% are edible and are safe. But yeah, there are things out there that are very poisonous. More often than not, usually, like if it's some type of mushroom, the reaction that one would get is just upset stomachs or upset stomach. That's pretty much it. There's mushrooms that can kill you, but there's not many here in Utah. And if you try to get those, it's very difficult to access. So
It's crazy
we
when
played it safe, but it was still interesting.
it's crazy. When I first met you, I saw, there's a sort of radiance to you as a chef, and the brand goes with Iron Chef, and all of these TV cooking shows, and you know, and then throughout the evening, I had heard about the Pretty Bird and fried chicken, but I was like always having this feeling like he's not here because of fried chicken. You just don't get to this, place right here. And now we get to hear the whole backstory of all of this, the training and all the experience. Do you miss the fine dining?
Every day. Every day. There's a certain creative process, a certain level of intensity and creativity that is involved in that type of cooking. You know, one of the reasons why Pretty Bird has become so successful is Pretty Bird is just a vehicle that really allows me to apply what I've learned into something that is very familiar, humble, and delicious. At the end of the day, it's not about putting something intricate out. It's not about me building this narrative around this dish. Like I'm like, here, Kenneth, here is a dish of native brown trout, locally foraged watercress that I went on a full moon night and harvested it under, heavy weather, snow and rain, and I hiked it back 10 miles and I made this delicious sauce that ties everything together. So the narrative is interesting. There's a time and place for it. But oftentimes I feel like a lot of chefs, a lot of young chefs, a lot of young cooks get carried away with the narrative and kind of lose sight about what really matters, the ingredient itself and how you execute it and how you cook. So there's a certain level of pretentiousness. To me, there's nothing more pretentious than for me to put a dish down and tell you why you should eat this and why it's cool and have this air about me. Those are the things that I started to grow very restless, knowing what I was doing. And, people like that. But I started to mature as a cook and I started to evolve and change. And that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to take everything that I've learned. So what's made Pretty Bird successful is that, one, you come in, you smell fried chicken, you come into a Pretty Bird restaurant, you know what fried chicken is. I feel like every culture has, a form of fried chicken. And what makes it different is that I don't have to give you this whole backstory of what Pretty Bird is. Although I am now, but it doesn't go with every single person. All the techniques, all the things that I've learned, the balance of flavors, textures, composition, all of that is applied to something that's very simple. At the end of the day, there's a lot of hype that's built around lots of different new restaurants, lots of different dishes. At the end of the day, I can tell you this, regardless of who you are, what background you come from, how you eat, your palate will never lie to you. Your mind will lie to you, your heart will lie to you, but your palate will never lie to you. And what I'm saying is that there's people that search out restaurants, near and far, the best, the worst, all of that stuff. And they take extreme measures to go experience these restaurants. And because they do, there's an expectation from their followers, their friends, their viewers, that this restaurant has to be good. So the person that's experiencing these restaurants, they're going to feel like the responsibility of saying it's really good because they took these extreme measures to get there and they don't want to look like a fool. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, like, is this a place where you want to come back? Is this something that has craveability? There's a lot of restaurants built around hype and a lot of people go there once, they go there twice, and eventually they realize like it's not that good. That hype train that is built up is very real. But like I said, people's palates don't lie. So with Pretty Bird, the idea is to build something that's extremely delicious, extremely craveable, and something that has longevity, not something that is very singular. So hot chicken, as you know, is something that has become extremely popular in the last 6 or 7 years. So hot chicken was established in Nashville, Tennessee. That's where it gained its popularity, specifically from a restaurant called Prince's Hot Chicken. That's where it was like invented. And then, I'm sure people from LA are very familiar with this one institution called Holland Ray's. Holland Ray's, I believe, is probably one of the first restaurants that brought hot chicken from Nashville to California. And, this is 2015, 2014, I believe. It became super famous. And because it got so famous, so many people copied, including myself. At the end of the day, we are not a Nashville hot chicken restaurant. We're a Nashville style. And when I say style, it's because there is a lot of heat that comes with our fried chicken, but it's not a singular heat. When you experience Nashville hot chicken, it's just varying levels of heat, and heat at a certain level becomes very addicting. Your body craves for it more and more and more. But for me, when I think about things that are spicy, making food spicy is relatively simple. You can pull out some cayenne pepper at home, put in a dish and make it really hot. Anybody can do that. But where lies the experience and the knowledge is being able to balance out that heat and flavor. Because as you know, heat can overpower anything. And you could put as much work into buying the best chicken, sourcing the best spices, the best salt, the best fish sauce. If you make it super spicy, all of that might as well go away. So being able to elevate casual cooking, understanding the flavors and balances, and then producing something that is flavorful yet has craveability. That's what makes Pretty Bird special, and that's where a lot of the years of formal training came from.
You go into a lot of theoretical, philosophical ideas about food and the notions of taste and flavor and profiles. If you didn't go to school, do you think you could have arrived at all this stuff intellectually? In other words, do we need as a chef to go to have some sort of foundation as it pertains to learning the different characteristics of cooking?
It depends. It depends on what type of person you are. So for me, I didn't really learn anything in culinary school. And if I think of out of 1 out of 10, what did I learn? I would say probably a 2. I learned some basic things, but again, I was also an individual that has always been very curious. Curiosity is probably what made me a very successful cook early on and then a successful chef, is because I'm always curious and wanting to know how things work, how things pair, how things would be if I were to do this or I were to do that, and having that sense of curiosity, it really helped me develop different flavors, and it helped me in my career. But if you're a type of cook that needs structure, then that school is for you, but at the end of the day, I think with any type of creative medium, there has to be a level of curiosity, and humility and humbleness that really could get you to where you could be, So if I didn't go to culinary school, would I have been successful? I think yes, because early on, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of magazines, read up on a lot of really great restaurants. And then I kind of dove down that rabbit hole, trying to understand what type of cuisine, how they did it, understanding the backgrounds of the chefs, and then fantasizing being in that and trying to create that, and that's what kind of, led my career the way that it's led, but at the end of the day, like I said, it's that sense of curiosity that I think is really, really important. And that's what really separates, a great chef from a good chef.
And how much time now are you spending in the TV world versus, on the ground building these businesses?
I guess it depends on who you ask. If you ask my wife, he's like, oh, he's not in the restaurants anymore. At Pretty Bird, we do a very limited amount of things. The core items that we have in our menu, I can list it on one hand. When we first opened up Pretty Bird, there was only 2 items on the menu, 2 main items. All the items together, if you count our French fries, our slaw, and our drink, it's really only 5 items. Now we have 10 items, which is still a very small. So we have 3 core items, and then we have, some sides, and that's basically it. So going back to being a chef, being an early cook early on, when you learn, you're like the sponge. You're absorbing all of these different techniques, all these different things, and you want to kind of apply them to all one dish. And what tends to happen is that your dish gets lost in translation. Let's just say, hey, today I want to do this this sushi inspired dish, and I want to do this nigiri, but I want to do all these complex sauces and all this stuff. And you're like, at the end of the day, there's like a piece of nigiri, and then there's the sauce, and there's all these garnishes and herbs and side things, and like, it's like, what the hell is this? As you start to mature as a cook, you start to learn self-restraint. So perfect example, as I just mentioned, Japanese culture, Japanese cuisine, fish and rice, 2 very simple things. How do we make it so harmonious, delicious, and beautiful? So knowing that and going through that path, I wanted to focus on just a couple core items, make it really good, and that's all that matters. There's no point of trying to do a salad, trying to do a grill this, a grill that, and offer all these things. We just do fried chicken. We do it extremely well, and we make it extremely delicious, and that's all that matters.
I'm going to throw you a quick curveball here.
Okay.
If you were to do a Vietnamese restaurant, what would be your stripped down version of it? What item? Would you do a rice dish, a pho dish, noodle? What would you do to kind of like mimic what you're doing at Pretty Bird? Because it's very complicated. Vietnamese cooking, there's so many different aspects and different types of food. But what would you strip down? How could you kind of really bring it down to its essence?
Yeah. Well, one of the first Vietnamese renditions that I've done was what you experienced. I did a Vietnamese banh mi sandwich, but Pretty Bird style, So nowadays, all I do is basically sandwiches. But the Vietnamese sandwich, it's not just a sandwich, as you know. There's a lot of complexities. There's a lot of different influences. Influence from the French. Introducing the baguette. There's a lot of different layers, and because of that, I love it. There's a lot of, as you know, there's hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese banh mi sandwiches. And there's very few that we stick to that we really like and love, and because of that, when I first did this Vietnamese style banh mi sandwich at the house for you to try, that was something that kind of like, I'm like, wow, I actually could do this. I could do it differently, even though that was done on a whim. If I had sat down and be more thoughtful, I think that I can do, something that's very familiar, complex, but also something that is complementary to the Vietnamese palate.
Wow, that is such, and full disclaimer, I never got to taste that.
I actually remember the conversation now. Yes.
I was so pissed. I'm not pissed at what happened. I got pulled out for a conversation, and that took up, the whole, time that you were serving it. And by the time I came in, there were no more left. I mean, it went by, I felt like in 15 minutes, they were all gone.
I think there was a lot of people that had not just seconds, but thirds.
Yeah, exactly.
But again, being a successful and great podcast person you are, you got to branch out and talk to people. And sometimes in these conversations, it gets carried away. And unfortunately, you didn't get to have any. But, hopefully one of these days if I get back to the OC or somewhere in LA County and we do Pretty Bird, I will for sure do a Vietnamese version of our fried chicken sandwich.
So you're saying that you're going to do the fried chicken sandwich, Vietnamese style banh mi at the restaurant?
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to do that,
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, like cooking has always been, a sense of my identity and who I am. And like earlier, like I mentioned to you, I have a very complicated relationship with our Vietnamese culture. And that complication has grown more and more as I've grown up. And, now in my career, I'm literally on the eve of turning 45. So I turned 45 in January. And at 44 years old right now, if you were to ask me who I am, where I'm from, and what I do, there's obviously a very general answer, but the complexity lies in to my complicated relationship with Vietnam and my culture, my name, all that, from growing up. And because of that complication, it's pushed me away from really absorbing, understanding, my culture, our culture. So, I credit a lot to my mom and Chu Kung from Red Boat Fish Sauce, because that was the first Vietnamese ingredients that I ever used in my cooking career. I remember this is probably, 2011 or 2012 was when I first got a bottle of fish sauce and started using it. And I didn't like it, as a kid growing up in a Vietnamese home, that thing smelled. That and like frozen durian that my mom would thaw out in the refrigerator. It was awful. I didn't want to use that stuff. But also as a chef, as you grow and mature, I mentioned earlier, like when you first start off, you copy, and you take things that really inspire you and you try to turn it in your own. There's only so much that you can do with that. And then ultimately you reach a stage where you're like, okay, everybody's kind of doing that. Everybody's shopping at the farmer's market. How am I going to produce something? How am I going to produce a dish that is uniquely me? So, as a chef, you start to dig deep. Okay, who am I? Where do I come from? And what is my relationship with that space or that place? And that's Vietnam. And for the greater part of my life, I've always been ashamed of it. I've always pushed it away. And here I am now, later in life, trying to break down those walls and learn more about my culture. And fish sauce was kind of like the gateway drug in a sense. If the simple ingredient that is quintessential Vietnamese can inspire me the way that it did, what about the countless thousands of other ingredients? So that's kind of where I am right now. It's been super exciting. Gung from Red Boat and his daughters invited me to go to Vietnam with them in November, and I haven't been back to Vietnam since 2001. And it's been 22 years, right? And Vietnam has changed. When I watch these videos on social media of Vietnam, it's not the Vietnam that I knew back then. Ever since the government opened up trade, the country is like the sponge that's absorbing, Western culture, and like it's so hip and cool, and it's not, this third world country that we used to think of Vietnam as war-torn country, and this complicated relationship that people had because of the war. It's so much more than that now, and that's, as a chef, those are the things that are really exciting for me, especially being able to visit after all of this change and this incredible momentum that our country is having right now.
It's weird. Men of our generation, Vietnamese American men, we experience this sort of weird trauma that I'm going to say it, the women don't experience. The Vietnamese American women don't go through the same traumatic experience of male emasculation. We don't go through, they don't go through, well, let's just talk about, frankly, like on the dating apps, Asian women are up at the higher end, and then Asian men are at the very bottom. It's a fact. And we have to deal with that. We have to toil in that space. And I started the podcast because these things are unresolved. And I don't think that they are ever going to be resolved for me, because I live in this heavy leaning Vietnamese space and heavy leaning American space. And I float, between the two extremes. So when I get to hear this sort of brief that you talk about with your return, this rebirth of returning to the culture and going back to Vietnam and being so excited, it excites me so much. But at the same time, I am also grateful that you and I both got to experience the pain of growing up as a Vietnamese American men here in America, because without those stories and without those pain points, we would be different people. And I'm very happy that you've become who you are today, because down the road, I'm going to have a sandwich that will be in my mouth and I can enjoy it because it is the fruits of a cultural sort of symbiosis that's happened. And
Yeah.
here we are.
Yeah, as you know, especially in, Vietnamese history, our culture, uh, we are very familiar with adversity, and like they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
I think that's what really has helped, um, people of our culture develop that resiliency. But yeah, you're totally true about how Vietnamese men are treated versus Vietnamese women, and the way that the media has portrayed Vietnamese women being submissive and being this kind of mysterious figure, and they're seen as like this sexual object,
Yeah.
that's submissive and all that. And I think that that's why it's kind of been that way. And then for men, we're kind of like the slant eye, short guy, small penis.
Yeah.
Like we're not
Desirable.
we're not desirable.
Yeah.
But I think that the media is slowly changing.
It's big time. Yeah.
Yeah, you've seen a surge of people of color on television, and I think that it's going to start changing a lot, especially with the developments of Vietnam, the relationship people are starting to have with Vietnam, and I hope that it changes. I myself am not married to a Vietnamese woman. I'm married to a Greek woman, and the mixing of our culture has been amazing. We do Vietnamese Greek foods, and my wife loves the Vietnamese culture, and she looks amazing in a Vietnamese ao dai, and it's I try to see things differently when it comes to that space, because I know it's a struggle. I know people don't like change, and I mean, to this day, I always notice that people give us looks when we're walking around, because it's not common. But it's up to us to kind of break those barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's up to us to control the narratives. And by the way, I did have multiple servings of the boat, of the lamb that you served. That was fire. It was so
I look back at the pictures like, man, this could have been so much better looking. But like, I just want to preface. So Red Boat invited me out to do a 10-minute cooking segment, and then this small little snippet commercial that I was supposed to do, and it was probably the one thing when I look back in my whole entire career that scared me the most. Speaking in Vietnamese, again, it has to do with my complicated relationship with Vietnam, but more importantly, I had to do this little commercial, like 3 paragraphs, speaking in Vietnamese, that required me not to speak in Vietnamese like at home, but in a formal tongue, So that was really, really complicated. But then when I was there doing this, all of a sudden, Gung from Red Boat, he's like, hey, do you think you could cook those up for, maybe 30 people that come? I'm like, well, really? So last minute, we had to kind of scramble and put those dishes together. We had to get extra ingredients. But, I guess it turned out well, and also, I don't know if but like, this is a little trivia, but fish sauce was not invented by Vietnamese people, nor was it invented by anybody in Southeast Asia. It was actually invented by Greeks. Yeah. And from the Greeks to the Romans to the spice trade, that's how fish sauce ended up in Southeast Asia. So that's a very proud thing that my wife loves to always remind.
You know who I brought this up with An Gung on our podcast? He brought that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was cool because I had known that, and I just wanted to hear it from him and have him explain sort of the history of actual fish sauce. And when I was it was a few years ago. Do you remember that hamburger brand Umami Burgers?
Yeah. Yep.
So Umami Burger is the first one that came onto the scene. Maybe it was 20 years ago. Was right by I was living right by it, and I would take my mom and dad there constantly, and we would look into the ingredients, and it proudly wrote fish sauce.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, I was like, okay, that's another dot on the map for, Asians here. They're using fish sauce in a hamburger patty. And that was one of my favorite hamburger places in the world. And it still is like one of the best to me. And they use fish sauce.
Yeah. Like when you think about fish sauce inside the hamburger patty, it really is nothing foreign because, in the American pantry, there's two ingredients that stand out. Oftentimes they're used on steak or even the marinades of certain meats like beef or hamburgers. And that's A1, Worcestershire sauce. If you look at the first or second line ingredient, it's anchovies. Anchovies has been a big part of the American diet, whether they like it or not knowing. It has always been a huge part in our culture. And also, because of fermentation, it brings out savoriness. That's what we know. People, now that food science is very prevalent, like there's an understanding of like fermented foods are better for you. But more importantly, fermented foods produce amino acids that are savory, that make you crave food more. It's that fifth sense, that umami that you had just talked about. But yeah, umami burger, when they started using fish sauce, it's nothing new because like at home, when you eat nam noong or whatever it is, balalap, it has fish sauce in there. So if it was delicious, it's delicious because of that. And, I credit the fish sauce to our success. The fish sauce is in our marinade, it's in our sauce, it's in our slaw. It's basically in everything, and it doesn't have to taste like fish sauce. That's the beauty about it. There's dishes where you want it to stand out, and there's dishes that could be made 10 times better by just having it, but where there's just enough to really boost the flavors without overwhelming it with the smell of fish.
Thank you so much today for coming on.
Yeah.
The time flew by in like 2 minutes. It felt like, it was like clinging on to every word. I'm like, I enjoy listening to your journey.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you so much, Viet.
And then also, by the way, I just have to add, I went through your blogs and not your blogs, but your podcasts, and I saw that you had Rachel Lee Cook, and I'm like, man, I gotta get on this podcast because Rachel Lee Cook, she was like my first like real crush, like, man, she was from She's All That, to like, This Is Your Brain on Drugs commercial, like bashing things. She has always been like somebody that I'm like, man, like,
well, let's talk about this. Let's unpack this. Do you know why she came on?
Because of her movie.
Yeah.
On Netflix. Yeah. And that was even more special, the fact that she did that movie. It's just like I feel that much closer to her than I was back when I was watching She's All That.
Yeah. And turns out that she was a big proponent of having Scott Lee in very scenes that we don't get to see. We didn't get to grow up watching a Vietnamese man make out with a white woman, and
in a lead role.
And I can't believe we're still even in this mindset. But here we go. We're gonna unpack this because it is a thing, and it is a thing that was really affecting us when we were growing up. Because having a white girlfriend was really the pinnacle of your success as an American man and a Vietnamese American man in the U.S.
Yeah. I know it's crazy, but things are getting better. We can reflect back and talk about all we want, but I think listening to podcasts like yours, sharing stories and experiences, I think those are the necessary and key ingredients in helping make this world a better place. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Viet.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. Special thanks to Brittany Tran, to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast.